Engel and our speaker today, Bill Federer, actually went to college together down in Dallas and then church together for a while. And probably close to 18, 19 years ago, Richard was able to get Bill to come by one of our meetings. We were meeting at a hotel restaurant at 39th and or I-44 and May Avenue at that time. And we had at that time a table of about 20 of us, and we sat down and we listened to Bill, and we were all amazed and fascinated at his grasp of history, government knowledge, and various things like that. Since that point in time, Richard, excuse me, folks, I'm running on about 4 hours here. Since that point in time, Bill has been with us probably 10 times over the years. Probably more than anyone else that we've had. And I'll tell you what, I'm looking forward to the next 10 times that he comes. Usually comes to Oklahoma at least once a year. And one time he was here for about 8 days. And I think we had him speak 43 times in 8 days. Now, that included some radio and maybe TV interviews or something to that nature. But he says, I like to speak. I like to be worked. And we were running him all over the state. And, I mean, we took him serious. If that's what he wants to do, we'll figure out the places for him to do that. But he's become a true fan of the citizens, the knowledgeable citizens of the state of Oklahoma. And he's a remarkable man. He also ran for Congress several years ago against the then Speaker of the U.S. House, Dick Gephardt. And without much support, ended up getting about 46% of the vote, if my memory serves me correctly. And if you've ever listened to the Rush Limbaugh program and heard the commercials that were done that year, it was a presidential year, and it was basically, you heard of breaking glass, you heard flames like they were burning a cross in front of someone's yard and various things like that. And these commercials were pointed directly at the black community in St. Louis to try to get them out to vote. But it really wasn't for the presidential election as much as it was to defeat this guy right here. And he lost with about 46, and he can correct me on this. And then he came back 2 years later, ran again, had a lot more support, but I think the outcome was about the same. But he came that close to killing, I'm speaking politically, of course, here, being known as the giant slayer and taking Dick Gephardt out. And so, anyway, as I have said in the email, and I want to warn everybody, I told you to bring your seatbelts, buckle up, because throw away your straws. Listening to Bill, the way he puts information out is much more like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant than it is a little water fountain. Please welcome Mr. Bill Federer.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, it is a tremendous honor to be amongst friends, Steve and Sally Kern, Paul and Cindy Blair, and so many others of you. I really feel at home here. We did have 2 kids born in Oklahoma. See, we also had 2 born in Texas, so we have interesting football games. But the elections are coming up. 2 weeks ago, I spoke in the Missouri State Capitol for Americans for Prosperity. It was against the Obamacare. And I sort of got everybody's attention when I told them that the Catholic Church invented health care. So what? You read through history, and other than some Egyptian temples and maybe a Greek temple where the royalty would go for some pseudo-religious / medical treatment, the common people didn't have any. The Christians took seriously Jesus saying, visit the sick, right? Take care of the poor. And in 325 AD, at the Council of Nicaea, they made the decision that every city that has a cathedral should also have a hospital. And then Syria was where there was a medical center. Edessa, Syria. By the way, Syria was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by Paul. And Antioch, Syria was the first city where Christians were called Christians. Right. And so these Christians in Syria had a thriving medical community. And then they went down to Persia. Jundi, Shapur, Persia. And there were these Syrian Christian medical families, and they would have 9 generations. They would start medical schools and teaching centers and so forth. And in Europe, they would go on pilgrimages to holy places. And when you would arrive at the holy place, you would probably be a little worn out, maybe sick. And so the church had these more or less convalescent homes where you could sort of recuperate from your long journey. And
you're right on 4 hours too, right?
this is where I did get 3 hours of sleep last night. But they would take care of them. And so hospitals were formed. The word hosp for hospital means traveler. It's the same root for hospitality, or hostel, or hotel, or host, like you're hosting a party. And there were entire religious orders that would take care of these travelers, right? Nurse them, and then change bedpans, and the nuns would wear the little outfits, and that turned into the nurse's outfit with a little hat, you know? And then when some of these hospitals were in dangerous areas, like the Middle East, they would have to defend them. And so there was actually an order called the Knights of Hospitaller. And so they would take care of the sick, but they'd also defend them. Well, when the Crusades were over and people went back to Europe, they carried the bubonic plague with them. And 75 million people died in Europe in the Middle Ages. And so nobody wanted to collect the dead bodies. And there was a Catholic order called the Election Brothers that would collect these dead bodies. And when people got the bubonic plague, they'd say, get out of town, right? They just banished them. And so they would take care of these people in like convalescent homes outside of the city. And those grew into hospitals. And so there were entire orders that did this. And then, of course, the Reformation comes, and then a lot of Christians begin to start hospitals. Then you look at the United States, and the largest healthcare provider in the United States is the Catholic Church, right? And so, and then you other denominations, you know, there's the Christian hospitals and Lutherans and Baptists and so forth. But it's a Christian idea to take care of the poor, to take care of the sick. Now, why do Christians want to take care of the sick? Well, religious convictions. There's this idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Whatever you do, at least he's my brother, you're doing to me. Sort of like what goes on in mission fields with medical missionaries. Most of them are Christian. You don't see too many atheist medical missionaries. There's not too many atheists going over, you know. These are people that are religiously motivated. They have Christian convictions to take care of the less fortunate. You know, Mother Teresa, you know, and she would take people out of the gutter in India and wash them. And she says, I serve because I love Jesus. I say, this is sick Jesus. This is what has gangrene. He says, you know, it's Jesus that motivates me. So here we have an interesting situation where our government is forcing the church and forcing Christians to give up the very convictions that invented healthcare. So Obamacare is saying, okay, you have to give up these convictions and do abortions and do stuff that is against your beliefs for the sake of healthcare. So the very impetus, the very convictions, the very Christian ideas that gave birth to healthcare is now being outlawed. Anyway, that's the one little thought I wanted to throw out there. Was that interesting?
Yeah.
The second thing is, just prior to the Civil War, America had two major political parties. One was the Democrat Party that was pro-slavery, and the other was the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, and they could not decide if they were the slave party or the free party. They sort of wanted to be the all-inclusive Big Tent party. So a new party got started in 1856, and the original plank of this new party was to take a stand for traditional marriage and the value of human life. The party called itself the Republican Party. And they took a stand for traditional marriage. What was that? Well, in Utah, they were having lots and lots of wives, and the original platform said to eliminate the twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. Now, back then it was the number, today it's the sex, but nevertheless it was taking a stand for one man and one woman for a marriage. But slavery, let's look at this issue. The country before the Civil War was divided into 5 categories geographically. So, the extreme north said, slavery's wrong, get rid of it now. And then the moderate north said, slavery's wrong, but we have to transition out of it. Take our time. Then, the practical neutral middle. These were people that just cared about money, money, money. jobs, economy, tariff, taxes, right? They weren't going to be bothered with these conscience issues. Then there was the moderate Democrat South that said, slavery's wrong, but we got to live with it. It's been here for centuries. Just make it rare and few and treat your slaves really nice. And then there's the extreme Democrat South that said slavery's good, and they tried to justify it by saying, well, Abraham owned slaves, sort of ignoring the fact that Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And these extreme Democrat South want to expand slavery to the new Western territories. There was a Democrat senator named Stephen Douglas that pushed for the Kansas-Nebraska Act so that it would be pro-choice. Let the inhabitants of the territories have the freedom of choice as to whether to come into the Union as a free state or a slave state. And then they passed the Dred Scott case in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave, lived in the free territory of Illinois and Wisconsin with his military doctor master. Comes back, and he could have sued for his freedom in those free states of Wisconsin and Illinois, and immediately got his freedom because of the state laws outlawing slavery. But he didn't know the laws, goes back to Missouri, and somebody says, hey, you ought to sue for freedom because you live there. He does. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Democrat-appointed Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney in 1857 gives the Dred Scott decision that says slaves are so far inferior they should be enslaved for their own benefit. Talk about a racist decision by this Democrat Supreme Court Justice. But then, something I wanted to highlight is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Now, what is that? The South had slavery. The people in the North had sort of grown apathetically accustomed to slavery in the South, but it was out of sight, out of mind. They didn't see it every day, so they were just sort of living their lives. The Fugitive Slave Law was these Southern pro-slavery Democrats saying, look, we got slaves escaping to the North, and they're helping them. So this law says you could not help an escaped slave get to freedom in Michigan or Canada. You could not give them food or shelter or clothing. And you could not interfere with the slave catcher's attempts to capture these runaway slaves. And you had to snitch on your neighbor. And if your neighbor was caught helping these escaped slaves, you were guilty, you were an accomplice because you knew about it. Now, what was the dynamic of this? This made it so that before the anti-slavery Republicans, they were called radical Republicans. Before it was like, you know, it exists in the South, but we don't have to think about it, so we're just going to sort of pretend like it doesn't exist. The Fugitive Slave Law says, look, you not only got to know that it exists, you have to approve of it and give your efforts to help enforce slavery. You have to dip your hands in the blood and be a part of keeping slavery legal. Now let's look at today. We have the extreme Democrat, or the extreme Republican North that says abortion is wrong, end it now. The moderate Republican North that said abortion is wrong, but we need to transition out of it. You know, a little legal battle here or there. And then the practical neutral. Money, money, money. These are people that say, all I care about is my job and the wages and the, you know, the union contracts and the tariffs and taxes. Sort of the Bill Clinton, it's the economy stupid.
State Chamber of Commerce, too.
And then you have the moderate Democrat South that said abortion's wrong, but we got to live with it. Just have it be rare and few and have it be safe abortions. Then you have the extreme Democrat South that said slavery's good, we want to expand it. These are like an Illinois state senator that voted to let a baby who survived an abortion attempt starve to death in a hospital closet. This is like the Medical Journal of Ethics in February of this year had an article on after-birth abortions. That a baby is the same baby as a fetus, and afterwards it's the same exact tissue, and if a parent should have the freedom to abort the baby, if it's in the womb, it's the exact same baby, they should be able to kill the baby out of the womb. This is like Peter Singer, the professor of ethics at Princeton, that said parents should have 30 days to decide whether or not to bring their kid home from the hospital, and doctors should be authorized to immediately kill handicapped babies the moment they're born. These are people that want to expand it. And now they have the Fugitive Slave Law. It's called Obamacare. Whereas the people in the North said, you know what, we don't agree with abortion, but we don't have to think about it every day. It takes place in these low-profile clinics in the city, and we don't really, it's out of sight, out of mind. What Obamacare does, it says, you not only have to be for it, you have to pay for it. Your mandatory health care premium that will be deducted from your bank account is going to go to this health care plan that will have abortions and will kill babies. So it's like a fire. It's not content with ashes. It wants to consume more. They're not content with allowing you to be against abortion. They want to force you to be for it and force you to pay for it. So this is the situation that we see in America. It's very similar to just prior to the Civil War, and it's just prior to today. Well, thank God. I loved Lincoln when he said, whenever I see someone arguing for slavery, I feel this strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. And Ronald Reagan said in 1981, he says, Lincoln recognized that we could not survive as a free land when some men could decide that others were not fit to be free and there should be abandoned to slavery. Likewise, we cannot survive today when some men decide that others are not fit to live and should be abandoned to abortion.
That's right.
So, thank you. Now I'm going to go to a third topic, and it is what is going on with the elections. Well, I did a book. I'm going to be talking about it tomorrow night at First Baptist Church in Moore, Oklahoma. It's called Change to Chains. It's on the table there, and I have a whole entire presentation, but I can't get into it. But just give you a little nutshell. I spent about a year researching every civilization that has ever existed on planet Earth. And I found a couple things interesting. One, the first records, written records, human beings writing down human records. They appear about 3000 BC. Maybe if you stretch, maybe 4000 BC, right? So 4,000 BC, we're 2080, that's 5,000 or 6,000 years. Sort of coincidentally, that's about as long as the Bible says man's been around, but nevertheless, so this, and by the way, 6,000 years is only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. 60, there's more than 60 people in this room, right? 60 people living 100 years each. We've all met somebody that's lived 100 years back to back. So one dies, one is born, you pass the baton to you. That's 60 times. You're all the way back to the very beginning of recorded human civilization. Now, guess what the most common form of government in all of these 6,000 years is? And I spent a year reading and researching every one of them, so it's absolutely documented. Guess what it is? What?
Monarchy.
Monarchy.
Oligarchy?
Oligarchy, but ultimately monarchy. So the most common form of government in all of world history is monarchy, a dictatorship. And it's human nature. That's the default setting. So you drop a bunch of kids on a playground, one of them winds up being the bully hogging the ball. Put a couple babies in a crib, one of them will end up grabbing the rattle from the other ones. Put some people in the woods, one of them winds up being the Indian chief. Drop a bunch of people in an inner city, one of them winds up being the gang leader. So it's sort of like the Lord of the Rings, everybody wants that ring of power. And now, when power concentrates into the hands of a Caesar, a Pharaoh, a Kaiser, a Sultan, a Tsar, a Chinese Emperor, an Aztec Montezuma, an Indian Maharaja, an Aztec Montezuma, or a King Kamehameha in Hawaii, no matter where you go in the world, this is the norm. What is rare in history is people ruling themselves without a king. Now, if the norm is, so it's a spectrum of power, one side's total government, the other side's no government. The total government side, power concentrates into the hands of one person, the dictator. And if you're friends with the dictator, you are more equal. If you're not friends with the dictator, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the dictator, you're dead. It's called treason. So equality is not you're made in the image of a creator. Equality is how close of an orbit can you get to this very important person, the king. And anyway, several attempts happened throughout history in these 6,000 years to rule themselves without a king. And I'm going to be talking about it tomorrow night, but the first one was, what do you think the most well-documented early instance of a people ruling themselves without a king was? Israel. The book of Judges, right?
Yeah.
So who owned everything in Egypt? The Pharaoh. He owned the land, he owned the people, he owned the crops. And the children of Israel left Egypt and they went into the promised land. And for 200 years, they did not have a king. that nobody could butter up next to. They were all equal before a law. And they had the maximum individual liberty and freedom, right? There's no king to take away your land or anything. So you could own your own land, you could own crops and sheep and cattle, and you could be in a position to lend and not borrow. And the Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. And anyway, after 200 years, the people of Israel went to Samuel the prophet and said, we don't like this, we want to be like all the other countries, we want a king. And Samuel said, you're not going to like it, he's going to take your best land, give it to his favorites, wealth redistribution. He's going to take your daughters, make them be his coach, sons, make them run before your chariots, his chariots. In other words, he'll determine the fate of your kids' lives. They said, we don't care, we want him anyway. And Israel's experiment was over. And Samuel cried all night, and God said, stop crying, they didn't reject you, they rejected me. So God's perfect plan for Israel was not to have a king. It was for them to be ruled equally under his law. And he could raise up anybody from the lowest to the greatest tribe to come to the rescue during a time of crisis and so forth. Sort of like our election system, where we can have God raise up tremendous people. Like a Sally Curran and like a Paul Blair and like many of the others that are in this room. And anyway, so another was Athens. Athens had a democracy. Demos means people, and krasi means rule. And I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll flip to the picture on Athens here real quick so you get a picture. I go through all this, and it's really pretty interesting. Athens was one of the city-states. Since the Greeks were all spread out amongst the islands, they really couldn't have an empire ruled by a king. They didn't have cell phones and communication. And so these different cities got to experiment, and Athens came up with a way called democracy. In Athens, everybody voted on everything. They would go to the market on every morning, called the Agora, and they would talk politics. If you did not keep up with politics in Athens, you were called an idiotus. An idiot. So you had to keep up on politics. And now if there's a king and you have an agenda, you lobby the king. If everybody makes the decisions for the city, how do you lobby everybody? Theater. So theater was invented not because they didn't have TV and they needed entertainment. Theater was always political. They extol some points of view, they ridicule others. Read through Aristophanes, you know, the tragedies and comedies. It reads like Jay Leno or David Letterman. I mean, it's still funny, but he's just poking fun at the politicians of the day. And from that time till now, media, theater, Hollywood has always been political.
Right.
So think of some sitcom or some movie that you're watching, and it has some character that's the hero. They're cute, they're funny, and as the series goes on, this person begins to make compromising moral decisions. Maybe lies here, maybe steals there, and you find yourself apologizing for the person. Yeah, I know that's wrong, they're sleeping around, but they're the hero, right? And so the bad person in the show is usually that old, stodgy, religious, traditional value person, and they're usually the weirdo. And before you know it, your views end up being lobbied, and you move in the direction very similar to the Greek theater. What happened in Athens? And is this interesting?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. There was a guy who lived in Athens named Plato, and he thought that democracy was chaos, everybody having a say in everything. And he said that the city government goes through 5 stages. The first stage he called it rule of the capable. These are people that know how to run farms and businesses, and they know how to run government. They're just responsible. And they're followed by what he called lovers of fame. These are people that don't know how to run anything, they're just famous, right? Maybe like a Hollywood actor that becomes the governor of California, right? I mean, what did he run before he became the governor? Really nothing. But what do these guys do? Once they're in, they vote themselves favors, and they create a clique called an oligarchy. And, you know, they get to do insider trading, they get to, you know, give out favors to their friends. And after a while, people get upset at the oligarchy, this rule of this clique, and they vote them out, and they finally put in a democracy. A rule of the people. Oh, great. But what has been the example for the people? This oligarchy voting themselves favors. So what does the democracy do? What do the people do? They vote themselves favors, and they raid the treasury, and they spread the wealth around, and then it gets squandered, and then they don't have enough money, so what do? They tax the rich more. And then there's no more rich left, and any that had sense left town. And then there's not enough money. What do? They have to fight amongst themselves because there's not enough money, and it turns into chaos. And so Plato said democracy without virtue and self-control always ends in chaos and anarchy. out of which a tyrant arises. So once there's chaos, people say, can't somebody come along and fix this? Can't we have a white horse or somebody that can just be the miracle worker? And so all power is concentrated into the hands of this tyrant. So democracy without virtue ends in chaos, out of which a tyrant arises. And what happens to the, matter of fact, Plato said, since we're going to have a tyrant, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. And the philosopher king, listen to this quote. 380 BC, he said this. When the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And what will they do? They will teach the children a noble lie. They'll teach the kids lies. And it's okay to teach him these lies because the lies help this king stay in power. And since he's a good king, it's good that he stays in power. So he's the head of gold. His administrators and military are the chest and arms of silver. And the people are the abdomen of bronze. They're the working class. And so every communist dictator has always claimed to be the philosopher king. I'm a little smarter than everybody else, and so on and so forth. And anyway, what happened to the Athenian democracy? There was a king to the north named Philip of Macedon, conquering cities, and he gets some gold mines. And what does he do? He takes the gold and he bribes some of these citizens of Athens under the table so that when they go into the Agora marketplace to talk politics, these guys spread propaganda. So as Philip's conquering, everybody gets together and says, hey, we got to get our defense going. We got to fight Philip. And they would stand up and say, no, Philip's really a nice guy. He's not conquering these other cities. He's liberating them. And so these paid traders would gather around themselves people that believed their lies. Lenin called them useful idiots. These are people who get out there with their Occupy Wall Street signs. Oh no, not quite sure why we're here, but we're just doing this because somebody told us to. Anyway, and so this is the situation when Philip marches up to the walls of Athens. They're so confused, they throw the doors open and he takes over. And the people of Athens did not get a chance to rule themselves again for over 2,000 years. After Philip came his son Alexander the Great. After him came the Roman emperors, and then the Byzantine emperors, and then the Muslim sultans. And then they got their independence, before World War I, but then they joined the EU and got in debt, and now they don't determine their fate again. Right. So a people ruling themselves is a very rare occurrence in world history. It's like the dandelion sprouting through the pavement of totalitarianism. Anyway, here's Alexander the Great, conquers all that, and then it gets split up. And I go through this in my talk, but I'm going to talk about Rome. Rome had a king who raped a girl named Lucretia. She was so distraught, she gathers the Roman leaders and commits suicide right in front of them. And these Roman leaders decide to kill the king and make a rule that if anybody in Rome ever would declare themselves king, anybody could kill the guy without any repercussions. So for 500 years, nobody wanted to come anywhere near being called a king in Rome. They were a republic. Now, republic is different than democracy. Democracy is you vote on everything. Republic is you take care of your farm and your business, and you have a representative that goes and keeps up with politics every day. And so res publica means in the place of. So that's where we get the word representative. It's in the place of. Republic means in the place of. And so they are in your place. So there was a guy named Publius. And Publius helped set up the Roman Republic. He was building a mansion on a hill in Rome. Rumor went that he was thinking of being king. When he heard the rumor, he tore down his own mansion before it was completed. Because he didn't want to come anywhere near being called a king. So Rome had 600 senators, sort of like, we have 435 congressmen, 100 senators, that's 535, then you add in the president, some cabinet, some judges, and we're close to 600 people ruling our republic. Now the Roman senators were not elected, they were hereditary, sort of like ours. And they went back to the founders of the Roman Republic. And as the years went on, these senators became wealthy and the people became in debt. And so there was a little bit of fomenting for a class struggle. Now, there was a guy named Julius Caesar that was from one of these wealthy families, but his grandfather had got on the outs politically, lost the money, and so Caesar was bankrupt. He joins the military to escape debt collectors, and turns out he's a great general. He conquers in Gaul, which is France, comes back with a lot of booty and slaves, and distributes them to the people. And so the people like this guy who gives out free stuff. And he decides to run for Senate. And he forms a triumvirate. A triumvirate is a group of three. So it's Caesar, the new up-and-coming popular guy with the people, and Pompey, who was the old establishment Republican guy. He was like, you know, the John McCain. He wanted to sort of keep the status quo, keep the people that are in power, and so then there's Crassus. And Crassus was the wealthiest guy in Rome. He was sort of like the George Soros of the day, sort of underwriting the whole thing. And Crassus dies, and it's a tug-of-war between Caesar and Pompey. And Caesar doesn't have any money because his rich underwriter, Crassus, is gone. So what does Caesar do? Caesar raids the federal treasury, the temple of Saturn, where there was 400 years of Roman gold stored up. This was off limits. Nobody in their wildest imaginations would ever touch this. They actually had a religious order. Of course, this is 45 BC, so this is before Christ. And this pagan order was to protect and guard the treasury. And Julius Caesar goes up to the guy in charge and says, give me the money or I'll kill you. Pulls out my sword, you know, and the guy says, okay, here's the keys. Now what does Caesar do with the money? He takes the federal money and he uses it to buy supporters against Pompey. And Caesar said, use money to get men, use men to get money. This is sort of like, you know, using stimulus money to hire Acorn and SEIU, you know, and maybe some union contracts and getting more people on the government's payroll and Social Security, welfare, food stamps. The more you can take, you take the money that belongs to everybody and you use it to buy supporters against Pompey. And finally, when Caesar got rid of Pompey and he got killed, Caesar made himself dictator for life. But this is what Will and Ariel Durant wrote. He says, in Italy, rival factions competed in wholesale purchase of candidates and votes. In 53 BC, that was the year Crassus died, one group of voters received 10 million sesterces for its support. So it's sort of like walking cash, right? You know, William Jefferson, they found an icebox full of cash, you know, there in Washington, D.C. So it's this saying, he who controls the purse strings has the power. It doesn't need to be your money. You just control the purse strings and decide who gets the money. And so anyway, Caesar sided with the populares, the people, against Pompey. And so it was this class struggle thing. And he said, oh, those rich people, they're your problem. We need pay-czars, they're making too much money. And so Caesar gets the people to back him. And finally, when he becomes the leader, he makes himself dictator for life. He starts the cult of Julius Caesar with Mark Antony as his high priest. He says he's a god. So forget the people. He says use the people to get himself elected. And if you didn't like 600 senators deciding the fate, now you've got one guy deciding the fate. And Caesar was so powerful he changed the calendar. Now the beginning of the year used to be March 1st. He changed it to January 1st. And we're continuing that today. Caesar named a month after. Matter of fact, the beginning of the year used to be March 1st. So the 7th month was September, because sept is Latin for 7. And October, was the 8th month. And Nov, 9, was the 9th month. And decimal point, 10. And December was the 10th month. But Caesar moved it to January 1st. Now, Caesar named a month after himself. You know which month it was? July, and it only had 30 days. So he took a day from the old end of the year, February, added it to July. The next emperor was Augustus Caesar. He named a month after himself.
August.
It only had 30 days, so he took a day from the end of the year, February, added it to August. That's why August only has 28 days. Anyway, if they would have kept that up, we wouldn't have had any February left. But here's William Henry Harrison. He says, Caesar became the master of the Roman people under the pretense of supporting the democratic claims of the former against the aristocracy of the latter. He says, it's those aristocracy, those rich people, and I'm for you, the people. And once he gets in, forget the people, I'm now a dictator. Anyway, I'm going to just fast forward through history, and this is an interesting point. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. And he said, pray thy kingdom come. So how can a kingdom come if it's not of this world, not earthly, cometh not without moderation? You can't see unless you're born again, and it is within you. This is what the founders of America attempted. They realized that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. You can't force somebody to make a voluntary decision. The moment you force them, it's not voluntary.
Amen.
And the God of the Bible is into voluntary decisions. Here's the tree in the garden. Adam and Eve, please don't eat from it, but it's up to you to do it. It's your choice. Gives Moses the law. Here's the blessings and the cursings. Please choose life, but it's up to you to choose. And so the founders realized that the God that we serve is into people making voluntary decisions. You could never force it from the top down. This kingdom was different. But the founders in America had this idea that if the majority of the people held these Judeo-Christian views, and they voted representatives from amongst themselves to be their leaders, and those representatives would make laws that reflected those Judeo-Christian beliefs, then the kingdom of God would come from the bottom up voluntarily, not from the top down forcibly. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's the experiment that America's founders attempted. Anyway, so does power flow from God to the king and then he dispenses it to the people?
No.
Or does power flow from God to the people and then they elect from amongst themselves their political leaders? That's what America's founders. So, in America, who is the king?
People.
The people are the king. I have a little word picture. Imagine you're visiting the king of Judah. And as you're walking through Jerusalem, you witness crimes and murders and rapes, and you get into the palace, and there's being nice behind the curtain and stealing. You finally get into the king's chamber, and he has his head in his hand, and he's all worried, and he says, did you see all this crime walking in here? I wish somebody would fix this mess. And you're like tapping him on the shoulder, excuse me, you're the king? These are your servants? This is your kingdom? You are the one to fix this? You're accountable to God to fix this? That's like today, in America, somebody watching TV and saying, look at these politicians, look at this crime in America, look at all these horrible things, I wish somebody would fix this. And you have to reach through the tube and tap you on the shoulder and say, excuse me, you are the king in America. Our founders set it up so that you are the one that makes the decision. The politicians are your servants. You hire them, you fire them, you vote them in, you vote them out. They're public servants.
Right.
So, just like that king that says, oh, I don't want to do anything, that is the person that says, I'm just so spiritual, I don't want to get involved in politics. I don't want to take that, I'm just going to just sort of let this happen, and whatever happens, happens, and I wish somebody would fix it. You're bringing the judgment of God down upon us. So instead of you being super spiritual, you're the one that's bringing the judgment because you have been given the right and the responsibility to rule, and you are a negligent ruler and letting evil rule. Anyway,
Amen.
Does that make sense?
Amen.
I'm going to give you a little bit of encouragement there. 10 centuries of Christians, and I'm just going to fast forward because I don't have time. This is all going into your subconscious. You'll have dreams about this tonight. Anyway, look at this. Talking about power concentrated. This is Genghis Khan. In one lifetime, he kills 30 million people, conquers from Korea to Hungary. It is the largest contiguous land empire in the world, even to this day. But nowadays, people can't even find Mongolia on a map. I found when empires are world powers, they have an invincibility complex, sort of like a psychological type of thing in their brain where they, oh, I'm the best. It's always going to be this way. And what happens is they get overindulgent and overstretched and in debt, and then the next kingdom conquers them. Anyway, I'm going to jump ahead. In the Incan Empire in Peru, everybody was employed by the state. Today, well, there's a lot of government workers. There's more and more government workers. In the Incan Empire, everybody was a government worker. Their entire lives were determined, and the emperor claimed to be a delegate of the sun god. And so this is the normal setting, no matter where you go. There's the Spanish Empire, all controlled by Charles V of Spain. It was the largest empire in the world. And then we got another couple of the Mughal Muslim emperors of northern India. They built the Taj Mahal. Interesting story. The Taj Mahal was such a beautiful building that Shah Jahan, the emperor, didn't want another building ever built as beautiful. So he had all the workers come and stick out their hands and he chopped them off. Hey guys, you did a really good job. Got a surprise for you. Anyway, China always had emperors and dynasties. 7 united. So very few, and I talk about it in my book, very few attempts to have a government without a king. So everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power. Pull up your other hand with your fingers apart and say separated power. Now go back to the fist and say concentrated power. That's world history. For most of the 6,000 years of history, power is in the hands of kings, pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, sultans, and czars. If you're their friend, you're more equal. You're not their friend, you're less equal. And if you're their enemy, you're dead. And every now and then, some people try to stretch the rubber band and have a government without a king, but it always snaps back, usually in times of crisis. So there's Israel, snaps back. Athens, snaps back. And there's the Roman Republic, snaps back. And there's some Italian city-states and so forth. But another one is the Dutch United Netherlands. And they had settlements in New Amsterdam, South America, Guyana, Aruba, South Africa, Goa. They took that from the Portuguese, Indonesia. And then they had an island off the coast of Japan. They had a monopoly on Japanese trade for 200 years. And they came up with a way to raise money without taxes, right? There's no king to tax. So how did they raise money to do all this stuff? They invented the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. You could invest in a boat that's going to Indonesia. When it comes back with spices, you get a portion of the profits. This is great. And when they settled New Amsterdam, they had a New Amsterdam Stock Exchange. And it met along a street where they had a wall. And the city got taken over by New York, and it was called the New York Stock Exchange, or Wall Street. So our Wall Street is a leftover remnant of the Dutch Republic, and it was a way to raise money without taxes, right? You know, the King of England, the king, you know, was underwriting these different guys, but this didn't have any king. Now, what if your ship to Japan sank? Well, that's when the Dutch invented insurance companies. Anyway, France controlled, here's Louis the 16th. He said that he was the Sun King, right? He said, I am the state. And they controlled all that huge area, you know, from Cambodia and Vietnam all the way to the Louisiana Purchase to Madagascar and parts of India, just huge. And then the Ottoman Empire, and then Catherine the Great of Russia. 12 time zones in Alaska, all controlled by Catherine the Great of Russia. Power concentrates into the hands of one person, and as the years go by, the stakes get higher. The kingdoms get bigger. And then you think, well, I guess we don't have monarchs anymore today. We do. We just call them communist dictators. Communism is monarchy. So, well, every communist country has a communist dictator. And the Communist Party members are the new royalty. They get to live in the nice houses. They get special treatment before the law, and then the people are the peasants. So it's still there, they just call it by different names. Anyway, German Empire, Japanese Empire, and then England. Do you know the British Empire was the largest empire in world history? 13 million square miles, 500 million people, all basically controlled by the monarchs of England. And the sun never set on the British Empire. And then we highlight how America was different. Now, I talk on my talk all about how unique America is and how we separated power, so here's the total government on one side, no government on the other side. America was able to get closest to the anarchy side of the spectrum of all previous civilizations on planet Earth because America had a secret ingredient. What was the secret ingredient?
God.
God. Christianity. Judeo-Christian morality. So, everybody in the country is taught doing to others as you would have them doing to you. And we're all equal in the eyes of a creator who's looking over your shoulder, wanting you to be nice. And so we could get by without a strong government and still maintain order because we had an internal government.
Right.
So we look at, it's a sliding scale. If people are going to have a government without a king, they need lots and lots and lots of virtue. But as they give up their virtue and there's more crises, people say government steps in, power concentrates, and as it gets concentrated, it gets more corrupt. And Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you think it's not part of human nature, imagine if you were the emperor. And you said, I'm going to be the best, perfect emperor. And your sister comes to you, and her teenage son got drunk and ran over somebody and is facing the death penalty, or at least life imprisonment. And she comes and says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get killed. You're not gonna... What are you tempted to do?
Kill him.
You would be the good emperor, okay? But for the rest of us, the temptation would be to say, okay, I'll let you off the hook, but don't let it happen again. And as soon as you did that, you would be the corrupt emperor. You would be sending the signal that if you're my family or friends, you get a little bit of an exception and so forth. I'm just going to fast forward. So if we want to see what's happening today, and our founders, they studied and studied and studied to try to figure out how to have a government without a king. I really love Washington because this is interesting. Jefferson is in France when they wrote the Constitution. He is back and having tea with George Washington. And he asks Washington, why a bicameral legislature? Why are there two houses, a House and a Senate? And Washington said, you yourself have proved the excellence of the two houses this very moment. And Jefferson said, how is that, General? Washington replied, you have turned your hot tea from the cup into the saucer to get it cool. In the same way, we desire the two houses. In other words, they realized it could take 200 years to build a house and one irresponsible match to burn the thing down in a day. They thought change was bad. They designed a system of government that was intentionally slow to change. Amen. Slow to making good decisions, but thank God it was slow to making bad decisions. So they never wanted anything passed in the passion of the moment. It would be passed back and forth until it just truly reflected what the people wanted. And they would never have thought of an imagined arbitrary deadline and saying, we have to hurry up and pass this thing so we can find out what's in it. That's exactly why they had the two houses, so that we wouldn't do something like that. Anyway, so our founders took the power of a king, separated them into three branches, separated them federal and state level, and then tied the whole federal Frankenstein up with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. All our Constitution is a bunch of hurdles to prevent power from reconcentrating into the hands of a dictator. And I'm going to just fast forward here to Washington. When Washington gave his farewell address, the world held its breath. They couldn't believe this guy, who was the leader of a country, would voluntarily give it up. So you see, kings killed to get power, kings killed to keep power. Washington had the power and he gave it up. So when he gave his farewell address, he had everybody's attention. And Washington warns of the pull of the rubber band. He realized that the normal thing that people are used to is a king. Somebody sort of tells him what to do. And so he says that there's this temptation, this pull that's going to want to pull us back there. And he warns in his farewell address. It says, usurpation. What's usurpation? Doing something you're not supposed to. You get away with it long enough. Everybody assumes these are the new rules. Usurpation, though, in one instance may be the instrument of good. Everybody say instrument of good. Instrument of good. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So he says, okay, there's going to be some crisis, and somebody's going to say, hey, this will be good, and it will be good. But the problem is, it's going to take power away from the people and concentrate it, and he says, this is how free governments are destroyed. So it was good that Lincoln ended slavery. But in the process, the federal government usurped a lot of control over the states with the Revenue Act, draft, and so forth. It was good that Woodrow Wilson got us through World War I, but he concentrated power, usurped it with the federal income tax and so forth, where power is concentrated now in the federal government. It was good that Franklin Roosevelt got us through the Depression, but he concentrated power into his New Deal programs. It was good that Truman got us and ended World War II, but he had us join the United Nations, and we only get one vote where we should have had 50, right? The Soviet Union breaks up, and every one of those former Soviet states gets a vote. Same people, same land, but, you know, so we should get 50 votes. Anyway, LBJ was good that he wanted to help the poor, but he concentrated power in the federal government with the great welfare state, right? And when you collect money and you give it out, the temptation is to give it to your supporters, to buy votes for the next election. And it was good that Nixon wanted to stop the drugs, but his war on drugs concentrated power into the federal government. Bush, it was good we have not had any more terrorist attacks, but power is concentrated so the government could read your emails, track your credit card purchases, strip search at the airport. I speak in 100 cities a year, I know all about that. And now we got a new president, and it's put on steroids. Exponential curve taking over banks and car companies and life and death healthcare decisions of every single citizen. So, whether you call somebody prince or president, if they dictate, they are the dictator.
Right. Yep.
And now, so usurpation, though in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. And I'm just going to fast forward here to crises. So, Washington continuing in his farewell address, he says, and a fatal tendency to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority. They are likely in the course of time to become potent engines, little unusual use of that word engine, become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which lifted them to the unjust dominion. Sort of like climbing a treehouse and then you pull the ladder up behind you. It's like getting elected president of Venezuela and then outlawing democracy. And he says this leads at length to a formal and permanent despotism. And then this line right here. He says, disorders and miseries, everybody say disorders and miseries. Disorders and miseries. Gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Disorders and miseries cause people to want to have somebody come along and say, I'll fix it, fine, take our rights and freedoms and just fix this mess. And he turns this to his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty, and then it becomes a real despotism. So, Woodrow Wilson, the history of liberty is the history of limitations of governmental power, not the increase of it. When we resist the concentration of power, we are resisting the powers of death, because concentration of power always precedes the destruction of human liberties. And so, just like our founders, one of the study philosophers that took the power of a king and separated it, there's other philosophers that wanted to take separated power and concentrate it. And we're going to look at just a couple. And one was Machiavelli. He lived 500 years ago in Italy. Italy was not Italy 500 years ago. It was a bunch of city-states. Venice, you know, and Naples, Florence, and they all had armies and navies and fought. Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So here's a scenario. The prince wants to conquer a city. The city doesn't want to be conquered, they'd hate it. But if this prince pays criminals under the table to burn barns, kill cows, create crisis and terror, the people will cry out for help. The prince will come in and kill the very criminal that he bribed to do it. Nobody would know the better for it, and they would praise the prince as the hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, and then you go around the front of the house and sell a fire extinguisher, and they'll pay anything for it and thank you for being there. Right? So it's Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. This was 500 years ago that the guy said this. Anyway, he also said this: a promise made was a necessity of the past. A promise broken is a necessity of the present. So believe it or not, a lot of politicians today study Machiavelli, and lying is part of the game. There's Talleyrand in France, and he said, we were giving speech to hide our thoughts, this word obfuscation. Here's Robespierre in France. He came up with a committee of public safety, sort of like Homeland Security. He says, terror is nothing else than swift, severe, indomitable justice. And so he had a reign of terror on purpose. And then there's Napoleon, but I'm going to fast forward. This guy, isn't he handsome? Yeah. This is Hegel, lived in Germany in the early 1800s. And he said the state is as God walking on earth. So he liked the state. He liked the government controlling everything. He came up with a theory called dialectics. Now, it's not a diet method. Dialectics is a triangle. And it starts off thesis on one corner, antithesis or antithesis on the other corner, and then synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. What it is you start here, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Yeah. And we see that every day, right? When the president took office, it was $1.83 a gallon. It goes up to $4.50. We're happy to pay $3.50. And so this Hegelian dialectic was adopted by Karl Marx. Karl Marx says, how do you create the antithesis? He says you send labor organizers and community organizers into the city to create crises. And once there's blood in the streets, everybody surrenders their rights and freedoms to have order restored, and that's when the dictator takes over. And they're happy that the dictator restored order, right? Whereas before they would have hated the dictator, but now it's so bad that they're happy to settle for the dictator. And so these organizers would organize the proletariat versus the bourgeois, which is the union workers versus the business owners. Organize the poor against the rich, the blacks against the whites, the Catholics against the Protestants, the Muslims against Christians, the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo. They really don't care who the two sides are. They just want the crises. They want the destabilizing. Right. Now, it works best if the people you're organizing are not Christian. Because even Napoleon said, religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. So if you have Christian poor, they'll just suffer. But if you get rid of Christianity, and then you get poor, then you can play upon their lust. And you say, hey, you want what they have, follow me, you'll get it. And anyway, so here is Stalin. Stalin said, crises alone permitted the authorities to demand and obtain total submission and all necessary sacrifice from its citizens. So this is a political use. He actually created an artificial famine. I mean, he killed millions of people because he wanted crises there. This is an interesting story. You got to follow me here. Stalin needed a crisis in 1935. There was a Tea Party movement starting. It was called the Anti-Stalinists. And he wanted to find a way to get rid of this group. So he had a supporter named Sergei Kirov. And Sergei Kirov was the party boss in Leningrad, and he loved Stalin. He would give speeches praising Stalin. So Stalin's idea was to assassinate Sergei Kirov and blame it on the anti-Stalinists. Nobody would suspect him because, hey, they're friends. And so he was able to use this as a purge to kill millions of the Tea Party movement, the anti-Stalinist movement, and wipe them out. And sort of like, what do we see going on in Florida with the killing that, anyway. This is an interesting guy. Talking about crises is the opportunity to assume power. Germany was in debt after World War I. They had to pay reparations to France and England. And they were in trouble, so they got a new political leader who would give speeches that were very inspiring, promising hope. 100,000 people in a stadium. He promised to turn the country around. He took over car companies like Volkswagen. He built the Autobahn. He registered all the guns, and then he confiscated all the guns. And he promised universal health care. This was great. Government's going to pay for our health care. But you add more government expenses when the economy is already suffering. What happens? Their economy really tanked. And so people said, government, cut expenses. So they decided to cut useless expenses from the government budget, like keeping alive retarded, insane, epileptic people. I mean, they don't even know their name. They're going to die in a few years. You know, they've already lived their life. They were called Lebensunwertes Leben, which means life unworthy of life. Then they got rid of the elderly in government institutions that had no relatives. Nobody's visiting them. This old person there, you know, look how sad they are. Nobody visits them, how sad. Let's free them from their body of pain. Then they got rid of the street bums, the beggars, the poor, the convicts. They were called useless eaters. I mean, why should you have to pay taxes to keep this criminal alive? Right? Then they got rid of the people speaking out against the government takeover, like the Dietrich Bonhoeffers. You know, the ones that were going around giving speeches at lunches, you know. They were actually used for... they were used for military medical research. I mean, don't just kill them, you know, you can get some mileage out of them. And then, based on evolution, they decided that the Aryan race were Ubermenschen, Supermen, and they wanted to eliminate the inferior races from the human gene pool, and they considered Jews and Gypsies and other as Untermenschen, under mankind, and they had the horrible, terrible Holocaust. So we scratch our heads today and say, how could this advanced country of Germany do something horrible like a Holocaust? Well, they had nationalized healthcare in their economy created, they had to cut expenses. Anyway, Castro says the revolution needs the enemy. The revolution needs for its development the antithesis. And it says if enemies are lacking, they had to be fabricated. So you need to have the crisis. And then there's this guy, Saul Alinsky. He was a community organizer in Chicago. Hillary Clinton did her master's thesis on Saul Alinsky. I actually spoke in her high school, West High School in Chicago. The professor had been there 40 years. He since passed away. But I spoke to 6 of his history classes. And he brings me over and says, this is the desk that Hillary Rodham sat in. And he says, then she went off to college and got mixed with some pinko Methodist preacher before you know it. Anyway, and then our current president was a community organizer with the Saul Alinsky method. And Senator Obama said his years of Alinsky organizing, he says, education was seared into my brain. Here's David Alinsky, the son of Saul. He says, Obama learned his lesson well. I'm proud to see my father's model for organizing is being used, blah, blah, blah. And this is the dedication page in Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals. Lest we forget an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical, Lucifer. Wow, that's interesting. Anyway, he says, in this book, we're concerned on how to create mass organizations to seize power. So what does a community organizer want to do? Seize power. The end is what you want. The means is how you get it. The real arena is corrupt and bloody. In war, the ends justifies almost any means, so you can do anything, lie, cheat, steal, give speeches on television where you just flat out lie to the whole country. Let's see here. Let's skip ahead. The organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. Let's see. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. You want there to be racism. Fan the latent hostility of many of the peoples to the point of overt expression. And this is sort of interesting. I was reading through Proverbs 6. It says, 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood like abortion, heart that devises wicked imaginations, he that's swift to running a mischief, a false witness, and he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. Soweth discord amongst the brethren. That sounds like fan the flames of hostility. That sounds like rub raw the resentments of the community. So we're seeing that it is dedicated to Lucifer here. He that soweth discord amongst the brethren. So this is a political strategy in elections. And it says a community organizer must search out controversy and issues rather than avoid them, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. And anyway, here's our concern, how the tactic of taking, how the have-nots can take power from the haves. And the president's former chief of staff said what? Never let a good crisis go to waste. And now we're getting a little closer. This is David Axelrod. He is the president's campaign advisor. He gave a speech on NPR radio April 2010. He said, in Chicago politics we have a tradition where you throw a brick through your own campaign office window and then call a press conference to accuse your opponent. Now, how do we apply that to the elections? Tank the economy on purpose, put people out of work, have gas prices go through the roof so everybody's screaming, then you call a press conference and accuse these rich Republicans that are making $22 million a year like Romney, right? Okay? So we see that they want an opponent that they can do their class struggle. They want to be the Julius Caesar that needs a Pompey establishment Republican that's wealthy, right? The people are in debt and they want somebody to blame. And anyway, now what's the best kind of crisis you can do? A financial crisis. And Columbia University professors adopted Saul Alinsky's method. They said you destroy capitalism by bankrupting it. In other words, you get rid of capitalism by getting rid of capital. And how do you get rid of capital? Taxes and inflation. This is a 1934 Chicago Tribune newspaper cartoon. We're going to zoom in here and zoom in here. It says, plan of action for U.S. Spend, spend, spend. Under the guise of recovery. Bust the government. Blame the capitalists for the failure. Jump the Constitution and declare a dictatorship.
Wow. Prophetic.
Says it worked in Russia. Anyway, spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery, bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, jump the Constitution, declare a dictatorship. Anyway, there's 2 ways to conquer. One is you march in with an army, and the other is you financially bankrupt them into dependency. Lots of empires in history have ended through bankruptcy. The Mongolian Empire, you know, is over. The Soviet Union. We defeated the Soviet Union by bankrupting them. It's called the arms race. We're spending money on arms. They tried to keep up. They couldn't. And they ended up going bankrupt. And they couldn't even pay their own government. And so we're doing to ourselves what they did. There's a biblical story that sort of goes along with this. Joseph in Egypt. Remember the story of 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine? Question for you. What happened that first year of famine? People said, we don't have food. Government, take our cattle, give us food. Second year. Government, take our land, give us food. Third year, take us and our kids and our posterity, just give us a handout. And all the power in Egypt was concentrated into the hands of one person, the Pharaoh. Now, if your goal is to be the Pharaoh, and you could intentionally create a famine and put people out of work, they'll sell their souls and their kids and their posterity just to get some food stamps, some welfare, to keep that Social Security, Medicare check coming, keep their government job or union contract. And so this is what Ben Franklin wrote in 1787, there is scarce a king in 100 who would not, if he could, follow the example of Pharaoh. Get first all the people's money, then all their lands, then make them and their children servants forever. I'm apprehensive that the government of the states may, in future times, end in a monarchy. So he felt the pull of the rubber band. So here's Washington saying, okay, there's going to be disorders and miseries, and there's someone that's going to promise a good thing. It's going to be usurping power in order to fix things. But then once the dust settles, you're no longer going to be a free people. And so here's Franklin. So this is an interesting thing I found. Jefferson, his advice to William Henry Harrison on how to take land from the Indians. Right? William Henry Harrison was the governor of the Indiana Territory, out of which 7 states came. he became the 9th president, but he was fighting Chief Tecumseh. Remember Tippecanoe and Tyler Jew? Well, Tippecanoe was a battle in northwest Ohio. And, but anyway, Jefferson writes him a letter. And he says, it's an easier way to take land. Instead of fighting the Indians, he says, be glad to see the influential individuals among them run in debt. Because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they will become willing to lop them off by a cessation of their lands. So you go to them and say, hey, don't, you know, we'll just sell you this stuff on credit. You can pay later. Here, buy some more. So we'll pay later, pay later. And one day you show up with this long list, you owe this much. I go, whoa. Tell you what, we'll take all the land from here to the river, call it even. It's like, well, okay, I guess so. So debt is a means of conquest. And it's like drug gangs taking over a neighborhood. You can go in and kill, or you can give away free drugs and get them all hooked, and they're dependent upon you. Anyway, then there's the IMF, and Jack Kemp, who I met, endorsed me when I ran for Congress, but he talks about how the World Bank lends money to these third world countries, they can't pay it back, and they say, okay, we now get all the assets of your country, and so forth. And so these are empires. Mongolian Empire under Genghis Khan actually invented paper currency, and then he printed too much of it and it fell. So, America's founders sacrificed their prosperity for their posterity. Today our government's sacrificing our posterity for prosperity, settling kids with an unpayable debt. So Deuteronomy 28 says, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord, thou shalt lend unto many nations and not borrow. And if thou shalt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord, these curses shall come upon thee. The stranger shall lend unto thee, and thou shalt not lend unto him. Peter Schiff, economist, said, in 1980, we were the world's biggest lender. Today, the United States is the world's largest debtor. We owe more money than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last 30 years, America has gone from the blessing side of the page to the judgment side of the page. And you think, what have we done in the last 30 years? Well, we've pushed a lot of abortion and gay marriage, and we're everything that, as far as the traditional biblical view that the founders had, would be antithetical. Here's our debt. So we talked about crisis, and what is the response? The response is always the same. Let power concentrate into the hands of the government. So democracy without virtue ends in chaos and anarchy, out of which a tyrant arises. So did I encourage it today?
Yes.
A couple more thoughts. In the last 70 years, 80 million people were killed by their own government in China. An atheistic government. And then 60 million were killed in the Soviet purges. And in Vietnam and Cambodia, Pol Pot here, he kills a fifth of his country in killing fields, open trenches. So has anything changed in human nature in the last 70 years that I missed? That this potential does not lurk somewhere in the dark recesses?
No.
So possibly there could be a fallout of us de-Christianizing ourselves as a country.
Absolutely.
And once the very same people that won't allow a kid to pray at a graduation and won't allow a coach to bow his head while the kids are praying on the field, when they get in charge of the guns, so Machiavelli, you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control, and then Islam is the ultimate concentrating power. Where most other ones just want to concentrate power politically or concentrate power militarily, Islam wants to consolidate power religiously. So a caliphate, I was talking to Alan Keyes, he says, I finally come to the conclusion that Islam is the perfect totalitarian religion. It's more or less communism with a God. And so there's a political aspect to it. So I'm going to fast forward through some of these quotes. Here's William Henry Harrison. In the name of democracy, they speak, warning the people against the influences of wealth and the danger of aristocracy. History, ancient and modern, is full of such examples. Caesar became the master of the Roman people, and the Senate, under the pretense of supporting the democratic claims against the aristocracy. Cromwell in England claimed to be the protector of the liberties, but he became a dictator. Bolivar in South America, he was there. George Washington, he got rid of the Spanish like Washington got rid of the English. And they were writing a constitution for the South American countries, but they didn't make him president for life, and so he tears it up and issues himself a certificate of dictatorship. And he dies 2 years later, and so South America's one brief chance to become united was over. And anyway, and William Harrison, in periods like this, crises, it behooves the people to be most watchful to whom they have entrusted with power. Yeah. So again, crisis, you got to watch out. Reagan said, here, for the first time in the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the Founding Fathers established the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, something really unusual happened in America. After spending time reading through the Mongolian Empire, the Attila the Hun, the Chandragupta in India, all these 6,000 years of empires, we really do have something really unique here in America. And it's slipping through our fingers like sand. And I can, from going across the country, talking to a lot of leadership, I find out that a lot of people think there's going to be a tsunami of voter fraud this next election. That our Attorney General is striking on every state law that says you got to show an ID. So you can buy cigarettes and beer, but you can vote for a president without an ID. And then they're expecting an October surprise. Some crises right before the election that will suspend the natural way things go, and whether it's a financial crisis, class warfare, or whether it's sort of backdooring, pushing Israel to a place where they have a war with Iran, and then the president can be the FDR wartime savior president, and the days will click by. Who knows what it is, but something is going to be there if it's a tight election. So that's my book, Change the Chains. And but a little encouraging thing, it's in times of crisis leaders are raised up. So if you feel a little bit depressed, the church was born into a one-world anti-Christian government, the Roman Empire. Yeah. My feeling is God's not afraid of one world. When Augustus Caesar controlled the whole world, he had to make a census so that Jesus and Mary could go to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to have Jesus born. So God is God over it all. Yes. Now, why would God be allowing these crises? Let's think. I put a little thing in here. Fast forwarding here. There's plan A and plan B, right? Plan A. God blesses you. You think of Him and are grateful, right? And you fellowship with Him and you love Him, and that's great. And then there's plan B. If plan A doesn't work, God withholds His blessings, and you're seeking His face. And then you draw close to Him. So, why did God create everybody anyway? He was totally sufficient in and of Himself. Well, God is love. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And if He's love, love wants somebody to love. And so, like parents, the couple gets married, they're in love, but after a while they want somebody else. Now, the little baby can't give them anything. It's totally selfish. It needs 24-hour care. Feed me, clothe me, everything. And but the parents want somebody to love. So God didn't need to make us, but He made us because He wanted to love us. He wanted somebody to love. And all the parent wants is for the kid to just say, thank you, I want to be around you, I love you. And so if your child is away at college, and you're paying these very big bills, and you pay the credit card, you see this money's being spent on drugs and partying and beer and booze and prostitutes and everything else, and then you're writing these $1,000 checks out to pay for all this stuff, what's the temptation for you to do? You know what, I just might not pay this month. And then all of a sudden the card's not working. And then the kid calls, hey, my card, well, you need to start cleaning up now, you got their attention. So what have we done in America since 9/11? Well, let's see, we went to church for 2 weeks, then we went back to shopping.
Yeah.
It's true.
Then we pushed more abortion, and now we're beginning to have everybody having to pay for it. We pushed gay marriage in a bunch of states, and I tell people gay marriage is not the end of the agenda, it's their beginning.
Oh, yeah.
They make a beeline for the preschool and begin indoctrinating little kids, and then they're not content with that. They want to make it unpopular to hold other traditional values. They're not content with that. They're just going to begin to persecute people that hold traditional other values. In other words, they're not content with coming out of the closet, they want to push you into it.
Yeah, that's right.
They want to enact a don't ask, don't tell policy if you're a Christian.
Yeah.
Right? And then it's not going to stop with that. It's going to continue to go until we might be a situation where there's some major persecution. Christianity is the largest religion in the world, and Islam is the second largest. 80,000 people convert to Christianity every day. Most of it's in Africa and Asia and China, Middle East. But guess what? Over 500 people are martyred for Christianity every day, and most of it's in Africa, the Middle East, and China. So where the persecution is the greatest is where the revival is the greatest. So if the good Lord wants a revival of people coming to Him and plan A is not working, it might be plan B. Anyway, a lot of you are here and concerned, and this is my concern, is a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, Proverbs 13:22. We're going to be dead and gone, and our kids are going to be inheriting this place. unless the Lord comes back, but we don't know that when the time. So we want to do the best we can to leave our kids a country with as many freedoms as we have. That's why you're here. I want to thank you for that. And anyway, I'm going to go
We'll
ahead.
talk about your books.
Got some great books, $20
DVD,
each.
is this on? Is this
Yes,
your new
this is
DVD?
I did a DVD called Chains to Chains, and it's on the table. And then a book called Chains to Chains. And then a book on Islam, DVD on Islam, and then a book on America's God and Country that sold 500,000 copies. It's like a Bartle's book quotes. Another book, The Original 13. I've read through every charter of every colony. They all mention Christianity, except they all mention a particular denomination of Christianity. So Virginia was Anglican. Massachusetts was Puritan. Rhode Island was Baptist. New York was Dutch Reformed. Delaware and New Jersey were Swedish Lutheran. Maryland Catholic. Pennsylvania Quaker. Connecticut and New Hampshire were Congregationalists. And they didn't get along. And they chased each other out of each other's colonies. But then they had to work together to fight the King of England during the Revolution. After the Revolution, they said, we don't always agree, but you're willing to fight now for my freedom. I need to let you practice your faith. Anyway, so I put that in the book, The Original 13, and then a company one called Backfired, a nation born for religious tolerance, no longer tolerates the religion of its founders. Anyway, a novel my dad did called Wild as the Wind, and it takes you through real history from the French Revolution all the way through the Indian slave trade. Yeah, it's a great book. It's like an Indiana Jones read, but every single detail of history is factual, so you can be confident that your kids learn in history as you go through that. Book on George Washington Carver, American Minute book, so it's something that happened on each date in history. Bot Radio is so nice as to air those, and I expanded it in the book because on the print I'm not limited to the time. And anyway, book on income tax. There was none until the Civil War, and then it was reduced. And then Woodrow Wilson pushed through the first income tax, the 1% tax, and then a book endangered species. So prior to 1913, there was no IRS. So prior to 1913, churches did not have to worry about losing an IRS tax status. So prior to 1913, churches talked about everything, from abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, Sunday blue laws, prohibition, immigrants, everything. They were the conscience of the state. So politicians would do their stuff during the week and hold their breath on the weekends to see what the pastors were going to say about them from the pulpit. Now, that's been relinquished to the nightly news and the commentators. So politicians do stuff, they're afraid what the news is going to say about them, MSNBC or whatever. And so, anyway, so the idea is once we understand this, we can begin to do what we need to change it. So lots of interesting stuff on the table. I want to thank you. So you can sign up for my free daily email called The American Minute. AmericanMinute.com. And God bless you. You are doing a tremendous work in Oklahoma. We need to spread you all around.
And the cost is $20 a piece for books, for any of them, 20 a piece. AmeriSearch.
Right.
AmeriSearch for the check.
Or they can, if they make it.
Or Bill Federer. Yeah, either one.
I can sign it over.
Okay. Folks, thank you so much for coming today. I warned you about getting the drink out.